All right, thanks for joining us today. I've got Javvad Malik. He is a former analyst with 451 Group and an evangelist at Alien Vault and is now one of our security awareness advocates at KnowBe4. Thanks for coming on, Javvad. The reason that I brought you on is because just over a year or so ago, you took on this really, I think, insane effort to evaluate over 100 threat reports and see what the root causes for a lot of things are. So I got a couple questions for you about that. Number one is, what possessed you to feel like that was a good idea and to take that on?
So thanks for having me on, Perry. It's always a pleasure. So I think what we have in our industry is we say a lot of things, and a lot of things just get passed down as fact. And I think there comes a point where you have to stop and think, well, what are we basing this on? And sometimes it's based on things that were, research that was carried out in the 80s or 90s, or it's just become common folklore and or best practice. I enjoy looking at things from an evidence perspective or from a proof perspective. And our colleague, Roger Grimes, he wrote this book called Data-Driven Defense, in which he encourages organizations to look at the root cause. What is the initial access vector through which they get breached? And he puts in his book that there's probably about a dozen, probably no more than that, initial access points through which any organization can get breached. He says if you just focus on those 10 initial access points, then you are in a far better position than spending your time and effort running after the shiny, the latest APTs or those edge cases. And so I thought, well, okay, what is the number one initial access point, and what is it in terms of like the shiny? And so I thought we have all these great vendors out there that publish all these threat intel reports, and they're doing like nation state takedowns, and they're doing like, or uncovering organized crime rings. And I thought, well, okay, let's read a bunch of these reports and figure out exactly what the initial root cause was. And I thought 100 is like a nice round number. It's not a insignificant sample size, and it makes it easier to do the percentages for me afterwards.
Yeah, and to be clear, when you said let's read, that means Javvad reads, not let's as a collective group read all of these, because nobody would in our group would have held up their hand and said that they want to subject themselves to that. So number one, thank you for doing that. Number two, I guess, what were the shocking findings that came out of that?
So there wasn't anything shocking per se, but I think one of the most telling things was the initial access in the majority of cases. Nearly half of them was spear phishing. And actually, if you add in all the other kind of human elements, then social engineering forms the vast majority, which completely backs up what Roger had said in his book and what other reports had said. But this was really good affirmation, to see it within the actual data itself. There are a couple of caveats, like any research sort of piece. There are some caveats here. A lot of these reports, they focus on either nation states or large organized criminal activities, and ones which were like reusing the same tools and tactics across different victims. So it overlooks a lot of the smaller players out there, or the one-off, or the insider threats, and all those kinds of things. This is very much an outside-in approach. So I'd still say organizations need to look at their internal data, look at, say, like the incidents that you've had in your organization over the last couple of years, and then work out from that what for your organization are those initial access vectors. But from outside in, it's definitely all about the social engineering.
Yeah, and really, I think what you summed up is Roger's data defensive approach to evaluating the best way to protect your organization is to find those actual things that are impacting your organization or most likely to impact your organization, not to be led around by the whims and fantasies of the vendor community or whatever the new shiny thing is, and then to go after those. So thank you for doing that. For you, what are the takeaways for people that read this report? What do you hope that they do, and how can they make the biggest impact today?
So I think what the biggest thing for me is that, we don't suffer from a lack of information in our industry, or organizations don't suffer a lack of information. A lot of it is just about looking at the data and spending some time analyzing it and finding out what's relevant to you. And I'm reminded of the movie The Big Short, which is kind of relevant these days, but in that Christian Bale's character, he figures out what's wrong with all these subprime mortgages. And everyone's like, well, how did you know? And he's like, well, it's written in these contracts. And he goes, well, you read the contracts? He goes, yeah, I read the contracts. And for the financial industry, that was kind of like, wow, he actually read the contracts and he figured it out. And I think that's what we have a challenge in many aspects of life today, because of the vast data overload, is people don't stop to actually read or analyze the data. So I'd say, like, go over your incidents in the last year. Forget about the dashboard that you've built for in the context of this, like your SOC or the metrics that you present to the execs every year or every quarter. Just think about what are the incidents that have happened and how did they get in? What was the initial cause? And then look at the controls that you can put in place to affect those. Because I can guarantee, like, you will end up leveraging your controls far better. You can spend less and achieve far more security or lower your risk posture that way. And then at the end of that, then you can work out the long tail at the end of, like, what if this happened, or and go after those little edge cases that are relevant to your industry.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And thanks for taking on the Herculean effort of reading through all those and assembling the data and coming out with a great result that had insight. I really appreciate it. And thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no worries. Always a pleasure, Perry.
Right.